Thank you again, Mr. Leighton. We're coming up on one of America's most important national holidays. It's Thanksgiving, but sadly, a growing number of households won't be making God's blessings the central focus of their families as they sit around tables filled with wonderful foods and good things. Sadly, a lot of people won't be making that their central focus in this country. So when did the focus begin anyway on a national scale for a day of Thanksgiving? In 1789, there were some major historical events. It was a year of major events in the early part of America's history. George Washington was made the very first president of the United States in 1789. The U.S. Constitution was ratified that year. The Bill of Rights was passed that year. The Atlantic slave trade was abolished in that year. It doesn't mean that slavery in the southern states was abolished, but the Atlantic slave trade was abolished that year. October of 1789, something else happened that same year. Both houses of Congress, meaning the House of Representatives and the Senate, they're both called houses of Congress, by the way, they assigned President George Washington to choose a date in order to, and I quote, recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. So both houses of Congress gave a commission right away to a brand new president, George Washington, to pick a date, to assign a date, to recommend for a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. Then, 74 years later, in 1863, right in the middle of the heat of the Civil War, our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, established that same day of prayer and thanksgiving as an annual holiday, an annual recognition of Thanksgiving. And it had a fixed weekday every year, the last Thursday of every November. And so that's when that got established as an annual event based on the same thing that George Washington had appointed a date on. Think about something that has been slowly changing in our culture and society over the last couple generations. And what has changed? This is still by way of introduction. Think about our nation's educational system for a moment with me. The first common schools in America were very much Christian-based. And this was a completely natural development because so many of the new immigrants flowing to the American shores came as religious groups. Of course, we always think of the Mayflower landing and the Pilgrims who were looking for freedom from the oppression of the Church of England and how they had their different ideas of how they wanted to express their religious values and beliefs. But many other groups came to America as well over the decades, seeking to escape religious persecution and to establish communities where they felt free, again, to practice their religious beliefs. And in these little schools that would start up in the colonies, the Bible became the chief textbook. The Bible was the principal textbook in the lower grades. Homes or church buildings provided most of the classroom environments. This was before it became a federal mandate by 1918. all the states had to have a mandatory grade school for children. That was way coming up in 1918. Now, gradually, states began in their own state legislatures to establish mandatory schools. But it wasn't national until 1918. So this was a slow progression, but the Bible was the chief textbook. Early schools were established for the very purpose of Christian religious instruction. The simple reason is this: the settlers viewed illiteracy as a great evil because, get this, it denied people access to the Bible. And if you think back to the 1500s, to the Reformation in Europe, and William Tyndale and others that were very strong and at the head of the Reformation, they gave their lives in many cases and endured a lot of persecution for translating the Bible into the common man's language. I bring up William Tyndale every so often because the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible was considered the holy language, and anything else was a corruption of the scriptures. Yes, people could not read it in their own language, but William Tyndale translated 70% of the Bible into the common man's English language, and he opened doors to people to study the Bible like never before across Europe. The same was happening in France and in Switzerland and other places, in Germany too. But we're seeing a carryover for hundreds of years of people coming to American shores that wanted to be sure that people, even though most people they didn't live in an information age like we do, where it's essential to have a mastery of the language, of our current language. But back then, people mostly worked on farms, or they were, they worked very much physical labor jobs. They didn't have to have that intellectual capacity except to study the Bible. And that was so important to the early settlers in this country. So they thought illiteracy was a great evil because it denied people the access to reading the Bible. Parents wanted to teach children to read so they could read the Bible, which provided knowledge essential to daily lives and also leading to their understanding of salvation. Now, one of the early elementary school books in the New England area was called the New England Primer, or Primer, New England Primer. It was a central textbook for the Puritans. And it had all the names of the books of the Bible in it. Again, these were for the early grade school children. It had an alphabet lesson of rhyming sentences from the Bible. It included the 10 Commandments, and it had other religious memory training in it. It was commonly said the primer taught millions to read and not one to sin. In other words, it just showed that it had a lot of value in teaching little children, young children, morals and ethics and biblical principles. Then it was in the 1830s, jump ahead to 1836, when the educator named William Holmes McGuffey developed a textbook series, and it was called the McGuffey Readers. And this was a series that took them through their grade school years, and it kept on being refined, and more illustrations were added because the Puritan New England Primer didn't have the same illustrations, and it had stories and it had essays in it that were more appealing to children. But at the same time, it had Christian moral values throughout the writings. These books also helped standardize the use of the English language across the country. In fact, it became so popular, these McGuffey Readers, it became a staple textbook for grade schools across the country. It's reported that 122 million copies of the McGuffey Readers were sold by 1925. It started in 1836. By 1925, just looking at that length of time, 122 million copies. At one point, more than half of all American school children used them. And tens of thousands of them are printed every year, even today, because they're used in homeschools, they're used in other private schools, private school settings. You won't find these as textbooks in public schools, to my knowledge. If you do, wonderful, tell me about it, but I doubt it. What has happened in 100 years? What has changed? These values, as you and I know, are fading away and being replaced with something else. New ways of thinking. But these new ways of thinking are endangering godly values. So I'd like to speak on the remaining time today on how Christianity is under attack in the press, in the courts, in our modern culture, and how this major departure from our nation's Christian roots was allowed to happen. My title today, The War Against Christianity. The War Against Christianity. Please turn to 2 Timothy 3, verse 1. 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, it's a well-known passage dealing with thoughts and attitudes and behaviors of mankind in the last days. This is the second letter to Timothy. As you're turning, there's a side of Bible prophecy that doesn't describe all the physical events, the wars, the weather disasters, the earthquakes, the famines, the pestilences, to come upon the earth because of human wickedness. But it is a side of Bible prophecy that reveals the decline in thought, attitude, values, the changing of the human heart in the latter days. So we're in 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 5. Paul writes this to Timothy. I'll read this passage in the NIV, New International Version. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive. The New King James Version says blasphemers, or those who scoff at God and His Word. Disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, which means considering nothing as sacred or holy. Verse 3, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, meaning cruel, doing cruel things to other human beings, not lovers of the good, treacherous, wrath, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with them. I read that last sentence in this list of human behaviors that increases in the latter days. Have nothing to do with them. And that's a strong charge to not get involved in today's riotous protest marches and things that are that show a lot of human hostility. And the things we're seeing in the news, at least in some groups that are protesting right now, that are spray painting the storefronts of Jewish establishments and bakeries and the Democratic Convention Center in Washington, and different things that are going on that are showing more and more hostility, more and more violence, more and more vandalism. It says have nothing to do with that. Now we can see how many of the traits that I just read and we just read together have to do with the condition of the human heart, don't they? Don't they have to do with the human heart? We could say these are traits of quote-unquote inhumanity. Inhumanity, not the way God designed humans to live. So it's clear to see in the daily news that societies are becoming more jaded, more degrading, self-centered, hostile towards godliness, hostile towards religion, hostile towards Christianity. I brought a book with me that I bought years ago. It's a very interesting book by David Limbaugh. David Limbaugh was, or is, an author, but he's also the brother of the now deceased Rush Limbaugh. famous talk show host, Rush Limbaugh. Well, David Limbaugh wrote this one book. It's a New York Times bestseller, 2004. It's been in print for quite a long time. It's called Persecution: How Liberals Are Waging War Against Christianity. And the book documents the trend towards taking every vestige of Christianity and its values out of society in the name of diversity, in the name of tolerance, in the name of multiculturalism. I'll talk a little more about those buzzwords in a few moments, but again, things have changed in the last couple generations. The first chapter in this book by David Limbaugh, titled Persecution, the title is War on Our Public Schools. War on Our Public Schools is his first chapter title. He starts in this chapter saying discrimination against Christians and the suppression of Christian religious expression pervades our society, and its perpetrators are legion. There are many. He goes immediately into explaining something that's a misrepresentation, a misinterpretation in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights for Americans. He goes immediately to this modern misinterpretation. What is the First Amendment about? Well, it's right at our core of civics, learning civics in school. It guarantees freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and even the right to petition in an orderly way, right to petition grievances against government. This is something that is our rights as Americans. And it forbids Congress from both promoting one religion over another, and it forbids the government from restricting people from practicing their religion. Those are wonderful freedoms not every country in the world has. In fact, very few have. We're very, very blessed that many of those freedoms still stand, but they have to be defended. Those freedoms are under pressure all the time. Now, it sounds simple. The next part is called the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. The Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Let that think in. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It sounds simple. But starting with a landmark Supreme Court case in 1947, then growing in momentum through the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a movement to look at that Establishment Clause as a way of saying separation of church and state. Again, a gross misinterpretation. The Supreme Court supported it. But what did the Establishment Clause seek to protect in the Constitution? What was it really about? Well, a brief answer is because religious freedom in this country was of such importance, the First Amendment guaranteed the freedom, again, of individual religious practice, that everyone in this country could practice his or her own religion. Now, the vast majority of the development of this country was Christian in nature, but there were some peripheral religious beliefs, but the vast majority were Christian. So that is something that it is just the way that this country developed. The next phrase in the First Amendment is called the Free Exercise Clause. The Free Exercise Clause. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof of religion. Now we have, again, since the 1947 Supreme Court case, and then developing through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and up to today, we have people that wish to eradicate every trace of religion from the public view. And many times it's in the public school system, and they usually focus mainly on Christianity, don't they? The people that are so aggressively against religion in public view and in public schools, it's always Christianity that seems to be in the crosshairs. They throw around the phrase, which came simply from a letter that President Thomas Jefferson wrote to a religious leader several years after the Bill of Rights was well in place. It was this phrase that he was discussing with a religious leader, a minister. He said in his letter to this one individual, wall of separation between church and state. He used that phrase, wall of separation between church and state. And so that has been thrown around for the recent decades without an understanding of its true meaning. Once again, this letter by Thomas Jefferson was written years after the Bill of Rights was ratified. The irony of this was that in 1789, when Congress proclaimed this National Day of Prayer and Thanksgiving, it was just one day after it passed the First Amendment of the Constitution itself. It was only the next day that Congress asked George Washington to appoint a day for Thanksgiving and prayer. The day before that, the First Amendment of the Constitution was ratified, and it guaranteed the freedom of speech and that no law could be made to prohibit the free exercise of a religion. Now, activist judges have been around for decades arguing that since public schools are publicly funded by tax dollars, any vestige of religion must be kept out of schools. What an irony. I was reading a Prophetic Times is something that a minister named Jim Tuck produces, and then Ken Trabig, a pastor down in East Texas, puts out for anyone that's on that mailing list. It had one short article, very short article about one school that is offering a new class on Satanism. And it gives it a bright, cheery promotion for grade school. It's not high school, grade school. To come after school for 1 hour and enjoy this, learn something new, enjoy this class on Satanism. Some might look at that as a religion that's being promoted on school grounds at a public school funded by taxpayer dollars, and yet will it come under the same kind of vociferous attack as Christianity? It remains to be seen. There are people, there are parents that are up in arms about this already, and it may get pushed out of the curriculum before it even starts. I don't know yet, but this was something that was in a news article. So again, at the foundation of our nation, when the Constitution was written, Christian religious instruction was the primary purpose for education, at least at the grade school level. And that's very profound because it's changed so much today. Nowadays, Christian expression is treated as profanity. Many public schools and federal courts across the nation have rejected any semblance of having a prayer before a football game or a prayer group meeting during recess or free time on school grounds, things like this. Here's a case in this book, Persecution, by David Limbaugh, that cites, well, he cites case after case in the entire book, well documented, of schools and teachers being targeted and intimidated in this growing pattern of anti-Christian discrimination. And so he says, well, I'll get to that in just a moment, but for most Americans, this misinterpretation of Jefferson's words, wall of separation between church and state, didn't become apparent until another Supreme Court key decision was made in 1962. And that was to eradicate all public prayer in public schools, or prayer in public schools. And it was called state-sponsored prayer. Here were the words that were brought into question by the court in 1962 when a neutral, non-denominational prayer was written to be read in a New York public school that year. The prayer simply went like this. Here are the words: Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence on Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That was it. That was the prayer. And it made its way to the Supreme Court in 1962. And they made a sweeping judgment not to have any more prayer in public schools. Here's another case. Here's another case taken from David Limbaugh's book. This was May 1995. Samuel B. Kent, U.S. District Judge in Texas, decreed that any student uttering the words or the word Jesus during the high school graduation commencement would be arrested and jailed for 6 months. That's outrageous to begin with from a justice, a district judge, to say that a minor, probably someone who's 18 or younger, being jailed for 6 months if he said the word Jesus in his commencement address. Here are what the judge's words said. Make no mistake, the court is going to have a U.S. Marshal in attendance at that graduation. If any student offends this court, that student will be summarily arrested and face up to 6 months incarceration in the Galveston County Jail for contempt of court. Anyone who thinks I'm kidding about this order better think again. Anyone who violates these orders, no kidding, is going to wish that he or she had died as a child when the court gets through with it. Really offensive words from a district judge in those days. To be fair now, the judge prohibited references to any deities, whether it be Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Allah, the Hindu god Shiva, and on and on and on. He wouldn't allow any of those. So in that sense, it was across a level playing field, but as David Limbaugh says in his book, don't be fooled. These kinds of cases always involve Christian expression. It was well known at the time that invoking a Christian prayer was the issue that brought it to court. Again, how far we have strayed in our public school institutions since the colonial days, in the 1800s even. If you still have your place open in 2 Timothy, please skip down with me to 2 Timothy 3, verse 13. 2 Timothy 3, verse 13. And while we're turning there, how far we have strayed. When a nation forsakes and forgets God, something is going to fill the void. There's always something to fill a void, fill a vacuum. What is it? Nature abhors a vacuum. Well, that's true in philosophy, ideology, and religion. 2 Timothy 3, verse 13, here Paul is speaking about conditions that would follow the efforts of preaching the gospel. This too can be applied to things that we see in conditions in the last days. But this would have happened in areas where Paul had gone in and established congregations, and he was warning those elders that he left in charge, be on your guard. You're going to see other things happen when I leave. You have to stay vigilant in guarding the gospel, he's saying. Verses 13 through 15. But evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. But you, Timothy, must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them from, and that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. In this particular letter, he tells Timothy, be on your guard. Deceivers are going to creep in. Impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. And you look at this on a broad scale in Christianity in our day, not just in the congregations that are being newly established, where someone like Paul was leaving to go on to a different region and start other churches. Turn to 2 Timothy 4, verse 3 and 4 now. 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 and 4. Now we look at something that might lean more towards the latter days, more towards something that could have happened in his day, and it probably did, but we could see its application today as well. For the time will come, this is 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 and 4, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, They will heap up for themselves teachers, and they'll turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. Matthew Henry's commentary says, people will turn away from the truth. They'll grow weary of the plain and simple message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They'll be greedy of fables. They'll take pleasure in them. People would rather believe lies, in many cases, than the truth. This is just the human proclivity. This is why Paul commissioned Timothy when he departed from wherever Timothy was overseeing the congregation, wherever it was, to teach doctrine carefully and to guard it. Verses 1 and 2, back up to verses 1 and 2. I charge you therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season, meaning when it's a nice thing to hear and when it's possibly a conflict to hear the truth. When you might be up against opposition, Timothy, out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort. Rebuke is also a way of saying correct when people are going astray. Exhort is another way of saying encourage people, encourage them with all long suffering and teaching, carefully instructing with all patience and long suffering, carefully instructing people. Again, Paul saw the tendency of distortions creeping in after departing from an area where the gospel was preached. Guard the truth. Teach it accurately. Teach it diligently, Timothy. There has been a historical drift for people of faith when they don't stay vigilant in passing on the truth to each generation. There have been huge gaps in which knowledge of the truth has been lost and regained during revivals or during periods of time of restoration of the truth that's been lost. And we're living in one of those ages now. We're still living in 70 years into one of those ages of a revival of knowledge and truth that we're very blessed to have right now. And so each generation must vigilantly pass it on to the next to keep those gaps from occurring. At the same time, in our society, Christianity is drifting away from its roots. Let's get back to 1 Timothy 4, verse 1 with me. 1 Timothy 4, verse 1. Paul continues to warn Timothy of a future time when the general population that once had the truth drifts away from it and abandons it for lies, once again, would rather believe lies. 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 and 2. Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy. Now some specific teachings are mentioned here, but we're told that the same trend here we see that will happen in the latter days, the last days. People believing lies without testing, without proving. And this time is now. We're living in this age. It aptly fits our generation, whose foundation 250 years ago was in a construct of religious teaching and Christian teaching. George Washington was a firm believer in training our children in this country. He said this: true religion affords government its surest support. The future of this nation depends on the Christian training of our youth. Very profound and very simple and very clear. It's very true. He said it is impossible to govern without the Bible. Now he's talking about the foundation of godly values as the only way of securing a functional representative democracy, a constitutional republic, in which without the foundation of the Bible doesn't work. That's why so many nations on earth can have dictatorships and, oh, they're functioning governments, but they're oppressive. And the people cannot exercise their freedom of religion in those countries. In fact, under penalty of death in many countries, if you introduce Christianity into any number of Muslim nations, 14 countries in Northern Africa, all over the Middle East, the Arab countries, if you introduce Christianity, North Korea, I can go on and on about nations that will punish, and if they don't punish individuals, they'll even threaten and jail family members of an individual that wants to practice religion different than what is the state recognized religion. We're so blessed in this country that we don't have that right at this time. Daniel Weber added this. He said, "For a free government and a free people, the Christian religion is the most important and one of the first things which all children ought to be instructed." It was a different mindset 100 years ago, a different mindset. And there are indications that the day is coming when parts of the Bible will be deemed hate speech. It's already happened in Canada and other places in Europe. Here are a couple of examples. There was a WorldNet Daily article in October 2002. It cited a court case in Canada. The article was titled, "The Bible as Hate Literature." Most of you have heard of this court case because, again, it happened in 2002. But it was shocking. Canadians advance a bill that chills speech about homosexuality. That was part of the title of the article. Could the Holy Scriptures really be treated as hate speech in our country? Could a person receive a prison sentence for quoting the Bible? Well, it happened in Canada. That December, a Canadian court ruled on the case that certain Bible verses were considered hate speech. That same year, 2002, the month was June in Sweden this time. Sweden passed a constitutional amendment that adds sexual orientation to groups protected against quote-unquote unfavorable speech. In effect, it outlaws any teaching that homosexuality is wrong, carrying a sentence of up to 4 years in prison for quoting parts of the Bible that might condemn homosexuality as wrong, as ungodly, as unethical. U.S. opponents to this kind of legislation fear that the U.S. is heading in that direction, the same direction as Canada, the same direction as Sweden, because battles continue to be waged over the addition of sexual orientation, laws of protection. The transgender movement is growing in a massive way right now in this country right now. Sexual orientation is protected, a protected category against hate speech right now, and in employment discrimination right now. And who knows how long it is before speaking publicly or even privately in the confines of a church congregation against homosexuality. We don't know how long it'll be, but it's trending in that direction. There's no vacuum, once again, when godly values have been abandoned. Minds will be filled with some sort of philosophy, ideology, or religious belief. A new Pew Research data that was published just this week, November 15th. Pew Research reflects the cultural drift or shift where people are opting to learn about the news via digital platforms rather than the traditional news of turning on the radio, picking up a newspaper, a magazine, or the TV. Great numbers of people are moving towards internet platforms for news. 3 in 10 Americans get their news from Facebook right now. 1 in 4 Americans get their news from YouTube. 43% of TikTok users, now I don't know what the national number of TikTok users is, but those that do use TikTok, 43% of them get their news from that platform. Just in the past few weeks, we've seen news coverage of all this protesting, these college universities, students who were indoctrinated with ideologies by their professors, with ideas that are giving them license to express open hostilities and violent acts against other ethnic groups. Mr. Hanisco spoke and touched on this a little bit last week, talking about persecution as well. Ungodly ideologies have found their ways into courtrooms, lawmakers' chambers, schools, and especially universities. When you have young people from high school and college age growing up with certain ideologies taught to them over and over in classrooms, it's chilling to think that so many of them are going to be moving into areas of becoming lawyers, becoming judges, becoming teachers and professors themselves. It's chilling to think about what kind of ideologies they're going to bring with them. Because lying and distorting the truth and ignoring the truth have become so acceptable in our society. That has allowed so much disinformation and misinformation pouring into these unconventional new internet forums. It's just something where you can get away with saying so much on the internet that you can't in more conventional newscasts. And even then, though, mainstream media has all kinds of distortions, and so we have to put our judgment caps on and use wise judgment. We'll get to that in a moment, too. What will happen to the world at large when the guardianship of our freedom of speech and freedom of religion, with responsibility and accountability, go away? What will happen to a country when we no longer have these things and we can no longer defend free societies around the world and to help struggling nations to enjoy some of the personal freedoms that you and I enjoy in this country? What will happen? Well, there's a dark answer. It's seen in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 7. Please turn there with me. 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 7. Once again, Paul speaks of a time when there's going to be a loss for the love of the truth. And the whole population of the world, the vast majority of people anyway, will fall for lies and would rather listen to lies than the truth. 2 Thessalonians 2 and verses 7 through 12. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains, he, capital He, God is restraining for a certain period of time, and it has been for the past couple thousand years since Paul wrote this letter. He will do so until he is taken out of the way, until God steps back and allows what Satan has been planning for a long time to take place. Verse 8, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming, but not before he does his damage. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Once again, the lie is a term that scholars have tried to analyze and break down, but the lie is a massive deception that comes upon the whole world because they have no love of the truth. They'd rather believe whatever the lie is. They'd rather believe it. There's a specialist that worked with Focus on the Family in Colorado Springs, John Polk. He was a gender and homosexuality specialist for Focus on the Family. And he had a book, and he quoted in the book, it's quoted in this book by David Limbaugh. He said, I think the U.S. is not far behind Canada in its, what I mentioned was a making hate speech something that is you could face legal penalties for if you quote the Bible in certain areas. He says there are some possible scenarios. One, the Bible, at least certain portions of the Bible may be declared hate literature. One. Two, it could come to the point where churches will not be able to mention certain scriptures. Three, clergy, the ministry, may be subjected to criminal charges if they refuse to marry homosexual partners, couples. Four, another one, parents may be subjected to criminal charges if they refuse to allow their children to attend classes that teach about or promote homosexual behavior. And add to that transgender ideologies too. Now, add to that. Another one, possibly, our country could move toward expressing disagreement with homosexual behavior or the homosexual agenda, either verbally or in writing, could be considered hate propaganda. Another one, educators, including those at private religious schools, will not be able to refuse to teach homosexual curricula. These are just possible scenarios, even in private schools. One more, this analyst says religious institutions may not be allowed to teach anything non-supportive of homosexual behavior. And again, add to that any number of the perverse transgender ideologies. Take that to the next level, he says. It won't be just enough to be silent from the pulpit, silent in classrooms, but the population may be pressured to advocate it. Deviant behavior is being redefined as simply non-traditional lifestyles. And soften the tone of deviancy. Non-traditional lifestyles. So what is our responsibility? I've told you all this horrible stuff. What's our responsibility in a society that is growing in ungodliness? One, stay informed. Stay informed. Choose your news sources wisely. There are so many biased news sources and so many that are fringe and so many that are, shall we say, well, just don't put all the facts out on the table at once. Teach your children God's word. And our parents here in this congregation are doing a wonderful job of that. Teach your children God's word. Train them to read from their Bibles in a relevant, modern Christian translation. I was in high school when I bought my first hip pocket paperback. It was a paperback called Good News for Modern Man. It was just the New Testament. It was based on a version called Today's English Version. We don't promote such casual translations for critical study of doctrine, but it had a huge impact on me at age 17 without much other formal church teaching. I grew up in a kind of a lukewarm Catholic environment. I went to catechism for a couple of years on Saturday mornings. I went to church, but in the Catholic Church, we don't open our Bibles. We don't go home and the minister or the priest doesn't say, open your Bibles and read this. He doesn't even open a Bible himself. He reads all these things that the Catholic Church have in their literature. So this was a profound impact on me at age 17. By age 19, I was baptized into God's church. And it was a moving part of God's drawing me into the truth. And it was an exciting time. But it was just that paperback book was an early start for me to read from cover to cover the New Testament in a simple, easy to read, modern translation. And another thing, let's ask God continually for wisdom and discernment and good judgment. Pray that God gives us discernment, wisdom, and good judgment, because this next portion of my message is in regards to that. In this book by David Limbaugh, Persecution, he talks quite a bit about what lies beneath the disguise of the word tolerance in our society. Tolerance has become the new buzzword to a so-called more virtuous, more noble, higher level of thinking. Being non-judgmental, it's a catchphrase. tolerance. Tolerance can be a very good thing, but the modern twisted definition for tolerance is that all ideas are equal, all points of view are equally valid, none is more important than the next person's idea. We as a society are being pressured to accept this and even to approve of whatever anyone thinks or does without making value judgments. It's fine. Leave him alone. I'm not going to judge him. He can do what he wants to as long as it does not hurt other people or infringe on me. Live and let live. That was a C.Moen movie, wasn't it? Live and let live. This twisted definition for tolerance is so often applied to such a wide panorama of deviant sexual practices today. It's also applied to religion. All lifestyles and behaviors are just as good and acceptable as the next one. Again, how things have changed in just a couple generations. Are you and I to accept all behaviors and all ideologies as equal? Or do we to accept every person's truth as the other person's truth? Let me pause for a moment. We have some wonderful neighbors. A woman across the street, directly across the street from us, lost her dad at age 96. He was in slow decline, but he died about 2 weeks ago now. And my wife and I sent him a card, and I went over to talk to them just 2 days ago, and it was a sunny, warm day, and they were outside, and we talked a little bit about the events that led up to the hours before his death and during his death, and she was wanting to tell me all about things she had read about the crossing over and into the visions that people seem to have right before they die of, I saw light, I saw Jesus, I saw the angels, and Jesus was talking to me, and those kinds of things. And I just let her talk, and I didn't want to interrupt the flow of ideas that she had. But interestingly, this same neighbor a few months ago asked me, someday, I have some questions about the Bible, what happens after death. I said, I'm always available. Call me, we'll sit down, we'll talk, we'll have a cup of coffee together. We'll sit and talk about what the Bible really says, what happens after death. I don't think she's ready for that yet, but I'm always there. I'm not going to impose what we believe until she asks, but we're ready to give an answer according to the faith that we have within us. So they're wonderful neighbors. I told them they're just delightful to have for neighbors, and we appreciated them so much. And we hope that the family members that came after the death were helping with comfort and helping her get through the grieving period. And she said yes, they were very comforting to have. The neighbor or the family members stayed for a number of days and so forth. So that was just one of those things where one person's truth is not another person's truth. After all, aren't Christians supposedly to be tolerant? Yes, but what does that mean? Using proper judgment. We go back to the Bible to understand proper tolerance includes respecting other individuals, but making evaluative judgments without condemning those individuals based on God's word of truth. Let's turn to Matthew 7 and verse 1. Matthew 7, verse 1. There's an often quoted scripture from the Bible that makes a case for the modern definition, the twisted definition of tolerance of every lifestyle, every behavior, every attitude, and every idea that's out there. It's usually Matthew 7, verse 1 that people jump on, where Jesus Christ says simply, "Judge not, that you be not judged." And usually people will close their Bible at that point. I only did that for effect. That's all. Let's go back to Matthew 7, verse 1. Matthew 7, verse 1. Usually people turn away from the Bible and say, see, Jesus taught us not to judge other people's opinions, behaviors, and lifestyles, which includes practicing homosexuality, abortion, adultery, fornication, etc. Look, he wouldn't have judged, Jesus Christ would not have judged us in those matters, so don't force your ideas and your principles on me. Have you heard that before? Let's see what the rest of the thought was, lest we take it out of context. Verses 2 through 5. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with what measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, there's a plank, there's a big beam in your own eye? So Jesus continues, hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So the specks and the planks refer to values. And there is evaluating and judgment and discernment and wisdom in what is what, right and wrong, what is good and evil. Jesus was saying here, judge yourself first. That's the first step. What is good and evil? Judge yourself first. And if you have a critical or condemning attitude towards others, look carefully at our own hearts and minds before condemning even attitudes and ideas and behaviors of others. First, look at our own heart. This is what he's saying. Then we'll have the ability to judge righteous judgment. He's not saying don't use righteous judgment. He's saying do use it, but we first look at our own hearts, make sure our hearts are pure and right with God. Then we can present our what God says. I won't turn. John 7, verse 24 says this. This is the case of Jesus healing a man on the Sabbath, and he's facing his critics. John 7, verse 24. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Of course, he's being criticized for healing on the Sabbath and being condemned for that. And he's saying to his critics, be careful, don't judge just based on the outward appearance of things, but judge righteous judgment. The word judge in the Greek, many of you have heard this as the word krisis in Greek, krisis. It has a very broad definition. But we can see a common definition to distinguish or to decide mentally or judicially, and by extension, to judge before a courtroom, to punish, to avenge, to conclude, to decree, to determine, to order, to call into question, to pronounce a sentence. So you can see it has a very broad range of definitions, krisis does. And it also includes the possibility of condemning others, but it's not limited to that. Condemning, but not limited to that. Now in this message right here, I titled, The War on Christianity. God recorded some interesting conditions in ancient Israel and Judah that are disturbingly similar to our society today. I'd like to turn to Psalm 94, verse 1 with you. Psalm 94 and verse 1. I began scouring some of my previous sermons to see if I've ever presented this scenario from Psalm 94 with you, and I don't know if I have or not. I know I wrote a ministerial journal on this topic several years ago. Psalm 94, verse 1, as you're turning there. It's a case that happened in the distant past. The psalmist, which is unnamed here, described living at a time when evil was being tolerated and even promoted by his society and his government. There were false teachers. There were false prophets. The government itself was caving towards enforcing false principles on the population. There was corruption of true religion. There was the increase of lawlessness. Again, things that sound very similar to society today. In the psalm, he's contrasting an increasingly evil society with the endurance that is needed for the faithful, that we must wait patiently on God, who sees everything going on, God never misses anything that's happening, and waiting for deliverance from society's evils. Again, his words are relevant for us. Psalm 94, verses 1 through 3, sets the stage. O Lord God, to whom vengeance belongs, O God, to whom vengeance belongs. Shine forth, rise up, O Judge of the earth. Render punishment to the proud. Lord eternal, how long will the wicked triumph? You see this recurring thing in many of the prophets who are writing that are frustrated to see it seems to take so long before God judges the unrighteous, the wicked, those that are hurting others. How long, he says. Then in verse 4, the psalmist states what are the issues. And he presents these in prayer to God, verses 4 through 7. What are they doing? They utter speech, they speak insolent things. All the workers of iniquity boast in themselves. They break in pieces your people, O Lord, and they afflict your heritage, causing a lot of affliction. A lot of people are being oppressed in this day and age that the psalmist is speaking of. They slay the widow and the stranger. They murder the fatherless. Yet they say, the Lord does not see, nor does the Lord of Jacob, the God of Jacob, understand. Now, once this grievance was brought before God prayerfully, now we see a change in the psalm that's written for our admonition, a change to an expression of abiding confidence in God. And it is meant and written for us to be for our patient endurance and waiting on God in hope. Verses 12 through 15. We're still in Psalm 94, verses 12 through 15. Blessed is the man whom you instruct, O God, and teach out of your law, that you may give him rest from the days of adversity until the pit is dug for the wicked, the grave. For the Lord will not cast off his people, nor will he forsake his inheritance, but judgment will return to righteousness, and all the upright in heart will follow it. Then in verse 16, a setup question is asked. But the answer is really already known. Verse 16, who will rise up for me against evildoers? Who will stand up for me against the workers of iniquity? And the answer is very clear. It's a rhetorical question. God will vindicate the faithful if they endure, if they lean on him in hope and patience. For watching and praying, keeping up with cultural trends and thinking critically about what we hear, it's easy to see this same scenario playing out, and it will only get worse before Christ returns in society here and societies across the world. The author of Psalm 94 evidently lived at a time when his government, again, was also engaging in promoting evil. Read verses 20 and 21 with me. Shall the throne of iniquity, which devises evil by law, have fellowship with you, God? They gather together against the life of the righteous, and they condemn innocent blood. So in his language, he's saying, even from the highest levels of government, there are wicked laws being put into place that are starting to hurt people. Wickedness was being legislated by the government, much like we start to see in recent decades in a Christian-professing nation as ours. The evils in which the psalmist was protesting apparently had been practiced over some considerable period of time. It wasn't just sudden, it didn't happen suddenly, but they seemed to be prevailing. The evildoers were no longer operating in the shadows when you read the whole psalm, but they were now well out in the open. The evildoers and those that were professing evil had no restraints on them anymore. They were out in the open, and they were affecting the highest leadership, the instructors, the professors, the religionists of the land. The psalmist is saying that his own government had formed an evil alliance with the oppressors. Now, when we watch some of the tensions, the factions growing in our own governing bodies, even in the House of Representatives and in the White House, just in the last 2 weeks, we see so much division and we see so many things that are set up on just breaking down law and order in this country. We see similar things going on, but we must wait patiently on God because He sees these things as well. The psalmist was also explaining a tipping point had been reached as the evils in his nation got to the point where the righteous people that were still left in the land were unable to turn things around. The momentum had grown so great they were unable to reverse the trend. In his own words, protests against evil were no longer expected to change matters in ancient Judah and Israel. At best, these kinds of protests of the righteous would be ignored, and at worst, they would result in scorn and persecution of those that would speak out for what was right and good. In the proverb that says, when the evil are in charge, the righteous go into hiding. And the flip side of that is when the righteous are in charge, the people will rejoice. Both those things will happen, but in time. And we know where society is heading. Skip down to verse 17 with me. Psalm 94, verse 17. The psalmist gives a comforting answer to his frustration and anxiety. He says, and he puts it on a personal level because it's already to the point in the psalmist's words that society can't be reversed. There aren't enough righteous people in the land to protest loud enough without them being ridiculed, put down, persecuted, marginalized. Unless the Lord had been my help, my soul would soon have settled in silence. If I say my foot slips, your mercy, O God, will hold me up. In the multitude of my anxieties within me, your comforts delight my soul. Skipping to verse 22, the end of the thought. Verse 22, the psalmist shares the resolution in trusting in God without wavering. But the Lord eternal has been my defense, and my God has been the rock of my refuge. Now, can I say emphatically that we have come to that turning point past in which there is not enough righteousness in the land to turn around the evils? No, I can't say that. And I also have to say that God is still opening doors to preach the gospel in this land as well as around the nations of the earth. We just hope and pray, and we do pray for the leaders of the land, that they will have wisdom and judgment to defend the helpless, to defend religion, to put down those who would attack Christianity, who would attack Judaism, who would attack Islam, who would attack Buddhists, who would attack the Asians, the blacks, the Hispanics, any group, and put down persecution altogether. We hope that happens. Turn to Philippians 2, verse 14. Turn to Philippians 2, verse 14. I just have two more scriptures, I believe, before I close. Two more. This one shows that we still have a job to do in light of a society darkening around us. Philippians 2, verse 14. Here, Paul is reflecting on the words of Jesus Christ about letting our light shine before mankind. Philippians 2, verses 14 through 16, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God, without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Yes, I know, we've been reading this for decades. It's becoming more and more evident with every passing year. Among whom you and I shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Meaning that all the instruction that Paul would give to the congregations he was raising up would carry on and become lights to society in the ancient Roman Empire, where there were many evils, and evils were growing in his society, in his time frame, just as they are today. We're to be lights in a crooked and perverse generation. We are the light of the world, Jesus Christ says in Matthew 5, verse 14. I won't turn. We are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. This is the obvious thing to do with a candlelight or a lamp. You put it out so that it can illuminate the room. It gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Yes, a lot of that glorifying God in heaven could happen in another age, in another resurrection, another time, but that they will remember and bring back to memory the things that they saw in those who were a light in this age. So I conclude, when we see the strife and hatred on our streets, in our government bodies, in our society, in our university protests that are going on, when we see the love of many growing colder due to the increase of wickedness, Matthew 24:12, and we see this continuing war against Christianity, we must remember that human might, human power did not establish the Church of God, and neither can human might and power destroy it. God's work will continue on and will never cease until his mission is completed. Jesus told Peter, Matthew 16, verse 18, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, or the grave, will not prevail against it. Many human institutions come and go. Philosophies, ideologies, false religions, they change with the times. But the church that Jesus Christ built will always stand. No power on earth, nor in the human or in the spirit realm, will be able to snuff out the truth of God. Matthew 12, verse 13. Matthew 12, verse 13 says, but he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And then the end will come. And then we take comfort. What happens after that? Establishment of God's peace and his law and order on all the earth when he comes back as King of kings and Lord of lords. And the earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of God as the sands cover the sea. This coming Thanksgiving weekend, this observance of Thanksgiving is just about a week away. We often call to remembrance some of the freedoms we enjoy in this great land of rich blessings, more than any other country on earth today, especially our religious freedoms. And so let's do remember those things and give God the thanks for our tremendous freedoms that we enjoy now still in this land. Wishing everyone a most enjoyable Thanksgiving holiday upcoming.